Louis stood alone in the office long after the city lights came on. The building was quiet now. Too quiet for someone who had spent his life chasing noise, applause, influence, recognition. The view from the window was impressive. It always had been. But tonight it felt like nothing. He loosened his tie and leaned his forehead briefly against the cool glass. Below him, cars moved like distant thoughts, important somewhere else, urgent to someone else. He had everything he once wanted: power, authority, a name that opened doors before he knocked. He had the world at his feet, until one woman refused to be owned by his ambition. And yet, there was a weight in his chest that no promotion had ever lifted. Not because he had failed, but because he had succeeded, at the wrong cost. He thought of her then, not the way people remember love in moments of nostalgia, but the way you remember a decision you can never undo. The moment he believed he had time, the moment he chose power over love, and the moment, years later, he finally understood what that choice had taken from him. This story doesn't begin with heartbreak. It begins with ambition. Back then, his days were measured in goals. Every hour had a purpose. Every conversation moved him forward. He liked it that way. Structure made sense. Emotion didn't. She noticed this early on. Not as a flaw, but as a pattern. They met in the quiet middle of their lives, when neither of them was chasing fantasy anymore. He had direction. She had depth. They didn't fall into love dramatically. They settled into it carefully. He admired her calm. She admired his drive. At first, it felt balanced. When he spoke about the future, his voice sharpened with certainty. When she listened, she didn't interrupt. She understood. She didn't ask him to slow down. She asked him to be present. There's a difference. They spent evenings together without spectacle. Simple meals. Soft conversations. She learned his silences. He learned her patience. And for a while that was enough. The first warning didn't sound like an argument. It sounded like a question. They were sitting across from each other late one night. The room lit only by a lamp that hummed quietly. She watched him type on his phone while she spoke. Not angrily, not accusingly, just observantly. "Do you ever worry?" she asked gently. "That you're building a life you won't have time to live?" He smiled without looking up. "Everything I'm doing now is so we can live later." She nodded. She always nodded. But something in her eyes shifted. She didn't ask him to choose. She asked him to notice. And he didn't. Opportunities came quickly after that. Meetings that ran late. Calls that interrupted dinners. Weekends that turned into workdays. He told himself this phase was temporary. That once he reached a certain level, things would settle. Power, to him, was a doorway. Love was something he planned to return to after he walked through it. She adapted at first. She adjusted schedules, lowered expectations. She learned to eat alone. Not because she wanted to, but because she loved him. That's how it starts. The conversation that changed everything didn't happen during a fight. There was no shouting, no tears, just honesty. They sat together, closer than usual, but emotionally farther apart than ever before. She spoke slowly. "I don't need you to choose me over your dreams," she said. "I need you to stop treating me like something that can wait." That sentence stayed between them. Heavy. He frowned, not in anger, but confusion. "I'm doing this for us." She shook her head. "No. You're doing this for who you want to become." The truth of it unsettled him. He reached for reassurance instead of reflection. "Just give me time," he said. "Once things stabilize, everything will be different." She studied him then. Not the man he was becoming, but the man he already was. "Time isn't something you promise," she replied quietly. "It's something you give." He didn't answer. And in that silence, a decision began forming. Later that night, alone, he replayed the conversation. Not to understand it, but to defend himself against it. He told himself, love was patient, success was urgent, sacrifice was temporary. He believed growth required imbalance. He didn't see that imbalance, left unchecked, becomes abandonment. Power made sense to him. It was measurable, predictable. Love wasn't. So he leaned toward what he could control. The actual choice didn't feel dramatic. There was no declaration, just an email, a message confirming an opportunity that would demand more. More time, more focus, more absence. He read it once, then again. He knew what saying yes meant. He also knew what saying no would cost him. And in that moment, ambition spoke louder than love. He replied, yes. He didn't tell her immediately, not because he was hiding it, but because he assumed she would understand. That assumption would follow him for years. She noticed the change before he mentioned it. The way his schedule filled without discussion. The way plans disappeared quietly. She didn't confront him. She observed. She listened. And slowly, she understood something painful. He wasn't choosing power instead of her. He was choosing it without considering her. That hurt more. When he finally told her, his voice was confident. Optimistic. This is the last push, he said. After this, everything we talked about becomes possible. She smiled. Not because she agreed, but because she had reached clarity. And if it doesn't? She asked. He hesitated. Just for a second. That second was everything. She nodded again. The same nod she had given him for months. But this one was different. It wasn't patience. It was acceptance. And as she stood to leave the room, she said something he wouldn't fully understand until much later. I hope you get everything you're working so hard for. He thought that was support. He didn't realize it was goodbye, spoken quietly. The days began to blur. Morning meetings turned into late evenings. Late evenings became overnight decisions. Lewis stopped counting hours and started counting outcomes. Wins came quickly, the kind that felt validating, the kind that made people return his calls faster. Each success whispered the same thing. You chose correctly. He believed it. Power rewarded commitment immediately. Love never rushed its proof. That difference mattered more to him than he admitted. She didn't complain. That surprised him. No ultimatums. No raised voice. Just subtle shifts. Candy stopped rearranging her schedule to match his. Stopped waiting awake for him to come home. Stopped asking how his day went. Not out of resentment. Out of self-preservation. He noticed, but not fully. He told himself this was maturity. Two adults respecting each other's independence. What he didn't see was what she was learning to do alone. Success is loud when it arrives. Phones ringing. People congratulating you for decisions they didn't have to make. He grew accustomed to the sound of approval. At work, his voice carried weight now. People paused when he spoke. They listened. That feeling became addictive. When he returned home, the quiet felt unfamiliar. Not uncomfortable, just empty. He filled it with work. She reorganized her life without announcing it. Picked up interests she'd once postponed. Built routines that didn't depend on his availability. Not to replace him, but to stop disappearing. When he canceled plans, she no longer looked disappointed. She simply adjusted. That should have worried him. Didn't. One evening, he came home earlier than expected. The apartment was tidy. Calm. Too calm. Candy wasn't there. A note sat on the counter. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just practical. Went out. Back later. He sat down, confused by the unfamiliar role reversal. He waited, and for the first time in a long while, he wondered what it felt like to be an afterthought. He told himself this phase was necessary, that all meaningful lives required imbalance at some point. He thought about the future he imagined. Security, comfort, time eventually. He believed love was strongest when it endured sacrifice. What he never questioned was whose sacrifice it was. She didn't arrive home late. She arrived steady, centered. She moved through the room like someone who had made peace with a decision. They talked about small things. Weather, work, plans that no longer included us. He sensed the shift but didn't address it. He had learned how to avoid uncomfortable conversations. She spoke again one night. Not urgently, calmly. I feel like I'm living beside you, she said. Not with you. He sighed. Not in frustration. In fatigue. I'm doing the best I can, he replied. Candy nodded. That's what scares me. He didn't understand that answer. And he didn't ask. The opportunity that followed was bigger than the last. More responsibility. More visibility. Less space for anything else. When he accepted, he felt powerful. Invincible. He didn't notice she stopped asking questions about his work. She had already accepted the truth he was still avoiding. Her decision wasn't fueled by anger. Came from clarity. She realized she had been waiting for a version of him that no longer existed. Not because he had changed, but because he had chosen. She packed quietly. Not everything. Just what she needed. When she stood at the door, he was still asleep. She didn't wake him. Some goodbyes don't need witnesses. He found the note later that morning. Short, respectful, honest. I love you, but I can't keep waiting to matter. Take care. He read it twice, then once more, and felt calm. He told himself, she needed space. This wasn't permanent. She would come back, because love waited, didn't it? As days passed, then weeks. She didn't call. He didn't reach out. Not because he didn't care, but because he believed timing was on his side. Power had always rewarded patience. He assumed love would do the same. The announcement was met with applause. Not polite applause. Not obligatory applause. Real applause. The kind that rises on its own. He stood at the front of the room, listening as his name was repeated with respect, admiration, even envy. This was it. The role people waited years for. The influence he'd chased quietly. The authority he believed would settle everything. He nodded as if he had expected this all along. Inside, something tightened. Not fear. Not doubt. Just a strange stillness. His days became precise. Schedules optimized. Decisions streamlined. People adjusted to him now. No one questioned his absence. No one asked for more than he could give. Power was efficient. It didn't need reassurance. It didn't ask where he'd been emotionally. It simply responded to results. And he was good at delivering them. The evening of his official promotion, colleagues gathered around him. There were congratulations, smiles, glasses raised. Someone asked, "Who are you celebrating with tonight?" He paused, just for a second. "Friends," he said. The word sounded hollow even as he spoke it. Later that night, he returned to an apartment that felt staged. Everything in its place. Nothing waiting. He sat down without turning on the lights. The silence didn't accuse him. It didn't comfort him either. For the first time in months, he opened his phone and searched for her name. He hesitated before typing. What would he say? I made it felt wrong. I miss you felt premature. He closed the phone. He told himself tomorrow would be better. Power had taught him patience. Memories began arriving uninvited. Not dramatic moments. Not arguments. Ordinary things. The way she listened without interrupting. The way she celebrated small wins he'd dismissed. The way she had asked, once, quietly, "Do I still fit in your life?" At the time, he'd thought the question was unfair. Now it echoed. He started noticing couples in ordinary places. Not the kind of love that announced itself. The quiet kind. Shared jokes. Comfortable silence. Familiarity that didn't need validation. He realized something uncomfortable. They looked rich in ways he wasn't. Days passed. He waited for a message that never arrived. Not because she owed him one, but because he had assumed she would check back in. Love always had. This one hadn't. And for the first time, power offered no explanation. This time, he didn't hesitate. He sent a message. Simple. Measured. Hope you're well. I'd like to talk. He stared at the screen longer than he ever had during any negotiation. Minutes passed. Then hours. No response. It hit him quietly. She wasn't ignoring him. She was done waiting. The clarity of that realization unsettled him more than anger ever could. He had assumed love paused when unattended. He hadn't considered that it moved on. At work, everything was aligned. At home, nothing was. He noticed how easily he solved problems that didn't involve emotion. Budgets, conflicts, strategy. But this required presence. Something he'd traded away gradually, willingly. One night, alone, he asked himself the question he'd avoided for years. What if success didn't fail me? What if I failed love first? The answer didn't come immediately, but the silence around it felt heavy with truth. He closed a major deal, a milestone. The room celebrated. He excused himself early. Standing outside, city lights below, he felt the sharp contrast. Everything he'd worked for was real. So was the absence. Power had elevated him, but it hadn't held him. He realized something painful. If he reached out now, it wouldn't be from neglect. It would be from regret. And regret was a language love didn't always translate. Still, he knew he had to try, not to reclaim what was lost, but to acknowledge it. He stood at the edge of his success, realizing that timing mattered more than intention. That choosing later wasn't the same as choosing at all. And that some doors don't close loudly. They close when you finally turn around and see them shut. He didn't rush this time. That was new. For days, he carried the awareness with him, the knowledge that reaching out wasn't about winning or fixing. It was about acknowledging damage. He rehearsed words in his mind and discarded them all. Some sounded defensive. Some sounded performative. Some sounded too late. Eventually, he realized no version would feel right. So he stopped preparing. He sent another message. Not clever. Not safe. Just honest. I know I don't deserve your time, but I owe you acknowledgement. If you're willing, I'd like to see you. Not to change anything, just to say what I didn't say when it mattered. He didn't reread it, didn't adjust the tone. He pressed send and accepted whatever came next. The reply came the next morning. Short, measured. We can talk. No warmth, no hostility, just permission. And somehow that felt heavier than silence. They chose a neutral place, familiar enough to feel safe, distant enough to avoid nostalgia. When she arrived, he noticed the first thing that had changed. She looked steady, not guarded, not hardened, grounded. He stood. She nodded. They sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because they both knew too much. He noticed how comfortable she was with the silence. Once she would have filled it for him. She didn't anymore. He spoke first. Not about success. Not about work. About absence. I didn't realize I was choosing something else every day, he said. I thought love waited. I thought time was flexible. She listened. Didn't interrupt. He continued. I wasn't trying to leave you behind. I just kept moving forward. He stopped, waiting for defense, for accusation. It didn't come. She nodded slowly. I know, she said. Her voice wasn't sharp. It was clear. That's what made it harder. He frowned slightly. I kept adjusting, she continued, because I believed you loved me. And you did. She paused. But love without presence slowly teaches you how to live without it. That sentence landed heavier than any accusation. He swallowed. I didn't know how close I was to losing you, he said. She met his eyes. You did, she replied gently. You just believed it wouldn't happen. The truth settled between them. He had mistaken patience for permanence. He apologized. Not elaborately, not emotionally, simply, for not showing up, for assuming I had time, for making you wait for a version of me that kept postponing you. She accepted the apology, and that frightened him more than rejection. I still care about you, he said carefully. I don't expect anything, but I needed you to know that. She nodded again. I know, she said. Then, but caring isn't the same as choosing. He felt the weight of that distinction. He had cared for years. He had chosen power daily. She spoke slowly now. I had to decide whether to keep shrinking my life so it could fit around yours, she said, or to build one where I didn't have to ask for space. He understood then. She hadn't left him. She had chosen herself. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, just honesty. You weren't cruel, she said. You were focused. That sentence hurt more than blame, because focus had been his pride. He wanted to ask if there was still a chance. He didn't, because he finally understood. Asking would be another way of prioritizing his needs over her peace. So he stayed quiet. They stood. There were no tears, no promises. She offered a small smile. I hope your life is everything you worked for, she said. He nodded. And I hope yours is everything you stopped waiting for, he replied. She turned and walked away. This time, he didn't assume she'd come back. Same chair, same light, same view outside the window. But something essential was missing. Not her presence. The illusion that he could still choose differently. He sat longer than he needed to. Not because he was frozen, but because standing felt like moving forward. And for once, he didn't know where forward led. Work resumed the next day. Efficient, structured, predictable. People still respected him, still deferred to his judgment. Nothing in his professional life reflected the shift that had happened. And that, strangely, made it worse. Success didn't pause to acknowledge what he'd lost. It never did. Evenings stretched differently now. Not empty, just unoccupied. He noticed how often he reached for his phone with no reason. No message to expect. No update to wait for. He had mistaken availability for abundance. Now he understood the difference. He didn't replay moments to hurt himself. They came on their own. Not highlights, but patterns. How often he'd said later. How confidently he'd believed later was guaranteed. He saw now what she had lived through. Being important, just never urgent. For the first time, he stopped asking why she left. He asked something harder. Why didn't I notice when staying stopped being enough? The answer wasn't flattering. Comfort had made him careless. Achievement had made him inattentive. He didn't transform overnight. Didn't quit his job. Didn't abandon ambition. That wasn't the lesson. The lesson was simpler, more uncomfortable. Growth didn't erase consequences. Understanding didn't rewind time. There were moments he considered reaching out again. Not to ask for anything, just to share what he'd learned. He didn't, because learning, he realized, wasn't a bargaining chip. Some insights were meant to stay with the person who arrived late to them. One evening, after closing a major deal, someone congratulated him. You must feel complete, they said. He smiled politely. He didn't correct them, but he knew the truth. Completion doesn't come from accumulation. It comes from alignment. And he had aligned too late. He began to live differently. Not dramatically, intentionally. He stopped postponing presence in smaller moments. Stopped assuming people would wait. Not out of fear, but out of respect. He carried the lesson without advertising it. He didn't replace her. Not because he was stuck, but because he understood something now. Connection wasn't guaranteed. It was built daily, or lost silently. When love came again someday, it would meet a different version of him. That was the only redemption available. One night, standing alone with the city spread below, he reflected on the choice he'd made. He hadn't chosen wrong. He had chosen completely. And every complete choice excluded something else. Power gave him reach. Love had offered him depth. He chose reach, and lived with the distance it created. He didn't hate himself. He didn't resent her. He accepted the truth most people avoid. Some lessons only arrive after the moment they could have saved. That didn't make them useless, just permanent. He chose power over love, and he's paying for it, not with failure, but with loneliness and guilt. Yet not too late to change the man. And that, quietly, Louis learned very quickly that silence had weight. Not the peaceful kind, not the earned kind. This silence pressed against the walls of the apartment, stretched itself across the furniture, settled into corners that used to hold Candy's voice. It followed him from room to room like a question that didn't expect an answer. The first night she didn't come home, he barely noticed. He worked late as usual. Meetings that blurred together. Conversations that sounded important and meant nothing. He returned to the apartment well past midnight, loosened his tie, and assumed she had fallen asleep already. The lights were off. The bed was untouched. He frowned, mildly inconvenienced, not concerned. Candy had her routines. She was independent. That was something he admired about her. Or at least that was what he told himself when independence made things easier for him. The second night, he noticed. The apartment remained tidy, almost staged, the kind of clean that suggested intention, not habit. Candy was neat, but she lived in her space. She left traces of herself everywhere. Books half open, mugs abandoned, shoes kicked off near the door. Now there was nothing, just order. He sat at the kitchen island and read the note again. Went out. Back later. No signature. No emotion. No explanation. It unsettled him more than anger would have. Louis checked his phone. No missed calls. No messages. He considered texting her but decided against it. He didn't want to seem anxious. He didn't want to ask a question that might invite a conversation he wasn't ready to have. So he waited. Waiting, he discovered, was exhausting. The days that followed unfolded like a slow unlearning. He began to notice the ways Candy had shaped his life without announcing herself. The fridge felt emptier, even when it was full. The mornings felt longer. The evenings stretched too wide, too quiet. He told himself she needed space, that she'd be back, that this wasn't serious. After all, nothing dramatic had happened. No shouting, no slammed doors, no ultimatums. Just a woman who had finally stopped waiting. Louis buried himself in work. He chased momentum the way he always had, by moving faster than his thoughts. Success came easily. It always had. Promotion was announced. A deal closed. Applause filled rooms where people said his name with admiration. He smiled. He nodded. He shook hands. And each time he returned home, the apartment greeted him with the same composed indifference. Candy didn't call. That was the part that bothered him most. Not because he missed her voice, he wasn't ready to admit that, but because the silence suggested something final. Candy had never used absence as punishment. If she was quiet, it meant she had made a decision. That thought lodged itself in his chest and refused to move. One evening, he came home earlier than expected. The sun hadn't fully set yet, and the city outside the windows glowed softly, suspended between day and night. He dropped his keys on the counter and listened. Nothing. He walked through the apartment slowly, as though moving too fast might disturb the illusion that she was just in the other room. Her closet was missing pieces. Not everything, just enough. That was when understanding began, not fully, not clearly, but enough to hurt. Candy hadn't left impulsively. She hadn't packed in anger or confusion. She had left the way she lived, deliberately. Louis sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to do next. He thought back to their last real conversation. Not the logistical exchanges. Not the polite check-ins. The last moment where she had tried, truly tried, to reach him. "I don't need you to choose me over your dreams," she had said. "I need you to stop treating me like something that can wait." At the time, he had heard pressure, a misunderstanding, an emotional exaggeration. Now he heard clarity. Candy hadn't asked for less ambition. She had asked for presence, for inclusion, for a place that wasn't conditional on his availability. And he had responded with intentions instead of action. That night, Louis poured himself a drink he didn't want and sat in the dark longer than necessary. His phone lay beside him, face down. He didn't pick it up. Not yet. Days turned into weeks. Candy's absence became official without ever being announced. Friends asked casually how she was doing. Louis answered vaguely. He said she was busy, traveling, focused on her own things. All true, none complete. Late one night, after a long day that should have felt victorious, Louis stood in his office overlooking the city. The view was impressive. It always had been, but it felt like nothing. For the first time, the thought crossed his mind clearly. What if I didn't lose her because I failed? What if I lost her because I succeeded at the wrong things? That question followed him home. It followed him into the bedroom, where he opened a drawer he hadn't touched in weeks. Inside was a framed photo he hadn't realized he kept so close. Candy, laughing, unguarded, looking at him like she believed in who he could be, not who he was proving himself to be. His chest tightened. Louis sat on the bed, holding the picture, his phone heavy in his other hand. He scrolled through old messages. Conversations that ended with later. Promises postponed. Check-ins delayed. He imagined calling her. He imagined not calling. Both felt like risks now. For the first time in his life, power didn't offer clarity. Only choice. And choice, he was beginning to understand, was where consequences lived. Success arrived the way it always had. Quietly, efficiently, without asking how he felt about it. Louis stood at the head of the conference table as applause filled the room. Another milestone. Another achievement tied neatly to his name. People smiled at him with admiration that bordered on reverence. Someone clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You earned this." He nodded, smiled, said thank you. Inside, something failed to rise. Later that evening, he sat alone in the back of a car as the city passed by in a blur of lights and reflections. Normally, this was the part of the day he enjoyed, the transition, the space between responsibility and rest. Tonight, it felt like delay, like avoidance. His phone buzzed. Not Candy. A congratulatory message. Then another. Then another. He responded with brief acknowledgments, each one feeling increasingly hollow. When the car pulled up to his building, he hesitated before getting out, as if delaying entry might somehow change what waited inside. The apartment greeted him with the same quiet order. Louis set his keys down carefully. Too carefully. The sound echoed louder than it should have. He wandered into the kitchen, then the living room, then stopped in the hallway where a framed abstract painting hung slightly crooked. Candy used to straighten it every time she walked past. He stared at it, and for the first time the realization came fully formed, not as guilt, not as regret, but as clarity. Candy hadn't left because she felt unloved. She had left because she felt postponed. Louis sank onto the couch and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He replayed moments he had once dismissed as small. Her pausing mid-sentence when he checked his phone. Her quiet "it's fine" when plans changed. The way she stopped arguing and started observing. At the time, he'd thought that meant things were improving. Now he understood. Silence had been her exit strategy. He thought about how often he had promised after this project, after this quarter, after this deal. He had genuinely believed he would arrive eventually, that once stability was secured, he could finally show up fully. But Candy had never asked him to arrive later. She had asked him to arrive now. That night, he poured a drink and didn't finish it. He carried it to the balcony and watched the city breathe below him. Somewhere out there, Candy was living a life that no longer adjusted itself around his calendar. The thought unsettled him. Not because he needed control, but because he realized how much he had relied on her patience. Patience, he now understood, was not infinite. Days passed, and with each one, Louis became painfully aware of how much of his life had been structured around Candy without him ever acknowledging it. He reached for his phone instinctively when something amused him, when something irritated him, when something went wrong. Then he stopped. There was no one to share it with anymore. Friends noticed the change before he did. Someone asked why he had been so quiet lately. Another joked that he needed a vacation. Louis laughed along. He didn't tell them that rest wasn't what he lacked. Perspective was. One afternoon, he found himself at a cafe near his office, staring at a couple seated across from him. They weren't doing anything remarkable. They weren't even talking much. Just existing together. Comfortable. Present. Candy would have liked this place, he thought. The realization startled him. He had begun thinking of her in the present tense again. That night, he went through his phone properly for the first time. Not skimming. Not avoiding. Reading. Old messages. Voice notes. Photos he hadn't remembered taking. Candy laughing in the background while he filmed something else. Candy reaching for his hand during a moment he had half forgotten. She had been there. Consistently. Quietly. Fully. And he had mistaken availability for permanence. Louis leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time, the idea surfaced, not as fear but as truth. Understanding doesn't reverse consequences. You can learn the lesson and still live with the result. That night, sleep came in fragments. Dreams stitched together memories he hadn't invited. Candy standing in doorways. Candy watching him from across rooms. Candy turning away, not angrily, not sadly, but decisively. In the morning, he woke with a heaviness that no accomplishment could offset. Weeks later, Louis found himself at an industry event he had once dreamed of attending. Cameras flashed. Names were spoken. His presence mattered here. He stepped aside from the crowd and stood near a window, watching his reflection overlay the city beyond. He looked the same, confident, composed, successful. But behind the image was a man who finally understood what he had traded. He had chosen power over love. Not because he didn't value love, but because he believed love would wait. That belief, more than ambition, had been his mistake. The realization didn't break him. It reshaped him. For the first time, he didn't want more. He wanted different. That evening, back in the apartment, Louis opened the drawer again and took out Candy's picture. He studied her face closely this time. Not the smile, but the eyes. The expectation. The hope that had once lived there. His phone rested in his palm. He didn't dial yet, but he no longer told himself there was no rush. Because now he understood something that couldn't be undone. Some lessons arrive too late to save the moment, but not too late to change the man standing in its aftermath. The night Louis finally broke didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no sudden tragedy, no dramatic failure. It arrived quietly, disguised as another ordinary evening. He came home later than usual, shoulders tight, mind dull from a day that had demanded everything and given nothing back. The apartment lights clicked on automatically, revealing the same composed stillness he had grown accustomed to. Too neat, too calm, too empty. Louis dropped his jacket over the chair and stood there longer than necessary, as if waiting for something to change. Didn't. He moved through the apartment without purpose, opening drawers he didn't need to open, adjusting things that were already aligned. He paused at the bookshelf where Candy's favorite novel still sat, a folded corner marking the page she'd last been on. She hadn't taken everything. She'd taken what mattered. The thought settled heavily in his chest. Louis poured himself a drink and didn't bother sitting down. He leaned against the counter instead, staring at nothing, replaying the quiet moments he had once overlooked. Not the fights, they had been rare, but the pauses, the waiting, the subtle ways Candy had made room for him without asking him to notice. At some point, he found himself in the bedroom again. The drawer slid open easily, as though it had been waiting. He took out the framed photo and sat on the edge of the bed, holding it carefully, like something fragile. Candy was smiling in the picture, head tilted slightly toward him, eyes bright with a kind of certainty that only existed when belief was intact. He hadn't earned that smile. Not fully. Louis stared at the image longer than he meant to. His throat tightened, and for the first time since she'd left, the feeling he'd been avoiding surfaced clearly. Not regret. Grief. Grief for something that hadn't exploded, but had simply been allowed to fade. His phone lay beside him, screen dark. He picked it up, set it down, picked it up again. He opened their last conversation, scrolled. Read without skipping. Each message felt like a timestamp marking where he could have chosen differently. Later. Soon. After this. Always after. Louis exhaled slowly and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His hands shook slightly, surprising him. He had negotiated million-dollar deals without hesitation. Faced rooms full of critics without blinking. But this required honesty. He imagined calling her. Imagined the sound of her voice. Calm. Controlled. No longer waiting to be convinced. He imagined not calling. Imagined years passing, success stacking higher, and this silence becoming permanent. That image hurt more than rejection ever could. Louis unlocked his phone and stared at her contact. Candy. The name felt heavier than it should have. He pressed call. The phone rang once. Twice. He nearly hung up. Then she answered. Hello. Her voice was steady, not surprised, not warm, just present. "Candy," he said quietly. There was a pause, not long but intentional. "Yes, Louis." Hearing his name on her lips did something to him. It stripped away the defenses he hadn't realized he was still holding. I didn't know if I should call," he admitted. "I know," she replied. No accusation, just truth. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, revealing. "I've been thinking," Louis said, "about a lot of things. I imagine you have." He swallowed. "I didn't understand before." Candy didn't respond immediately. Understanding, Louis realized, was no longer something she rushed to receive. "When I said I was doing it for us," he continued, "I meant it, but I see now that meaning well wasn't enough." "No," she said softly. "It wasn't." Her honesty landed cleanly. No anger, no cruelty, just boundaries spoken clearly. "I never asked you to give up who you were," Candy went on. "I asked you to let me be part of it." Louis closed his eyes. "I know that now. And what do you want me to do with that understanding?" she asked. The question was calm, but it changed everything. Louis realized then that this wasn't about convincing her. It was about acknowledging her terms. "I don't expect anything," he said. "I just didn't want silence to be the last thing between us." Candy exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. "I'm not a last-minute option," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I don't return to places where I'm convenient." He felt the words settle deep. "I know," he said. "And you're right," she continued, unwavering. "If I'm returning to you, it won't be because you've finally had time. It'll be because you've made space. Real space. And it'll be on my terms." Louis didn't interrupt, didn't negotiate, didn't justify. "Agreed," he said. The word surprised even him with its certainty. Candy was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm not promising anything," she said. "I'm just not closing the door." "That's more than I deserve," Louis replied. "No," she corrected gently. "It's what you're willing to grow into." They ended the call without grand declarations. No promises of forever. No rushed reconciliation. Just honesty. Louis sat there long after the screen went dark. The apartment was still quiet, but it felt different now. Not empty. Intentional. For the first time, power didn't feel like something he had to choose over love. It felt like something he could finally redefine. Louis didn't feel relieved after the call. That surprised him. He had expected something: lightness, hope, a sense of progress. Instead, what settled in was something heavier and far more demanding. Responsibility. Not the kind he could delegate. Not the kind he could postpone. Candy hadn't returned. She had simply clarified the conditions under which she might. And for the first time, Louis understood that agreement was not the same as entitlement. The days that followed were quieter than before, but the silence had changed shape. It was no longer accusatory. It was observant, as if life itself were waiting to see whether he would default to old patterns or build new ones without an audience. Louis stopped staying late at the office, not dramatically, not announced. He just left when the work was done. He turned down meetings that could wait. He declined invitations that existed only to reinforce an image he no longer needed to prove. First, no one noticed. Then they did. A colleague raised an eyebrow when Louis said he wasn't available that evening. Another joked that he was finally slowing down. Louis smiled politely and didn't explain. Change he was learning didn't need witnesses. He started paying attention to how he lived when no one was watching. He cooked instead of ordering in. He read without checking his phone. He took walks without headphones, letting the city exist around him instead of beneath him. At night, he thought about Candy, not with longing, but with respect. She hadn't asked him to chase her. She had asked him to meet himself. A week passed before she reached out. Not a call. A message. "How are you?" No affection. No distance. Just presence. Louis stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. Learning. Slowly. Honestly. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "That's a start," she wrote. They didn't talk every day. That too was new. Candy no longer filled the gaps in his schedule. She entered only where space had been made. Conversations were deliberate, focused, free of filler. One afternoon, she suggested coffee. Neutral territory. No expectations. Louis arrived early. He sat at a small table near the window, hands wrapped around a cup he hadn't touched. When Candy walked in, time didn't stop, but something in him did. She looked the same, and not. Her posture was lighter, her eyes clearer. There was a calm about her that hadn't been there before. Not because she was happier, but because she was no longer waiting. They greeted each other simply. "Hi," she said. They sat. Silence passed easily between them. Candy was the first to speak. "I don't want to go back to how things were." "I don't either," Louis said immediately. She studied him, not searching for reassurance but for consistency. "This isn't about effort," she continued. "It's about structure. I won't build myself into someone else's margins again." "I know," Louis said, "and I won't ask you to." She nodded once. "That's why this works differently now," Candy said. "I decide how much access I give. I decide when we talk. I decide what I need, and I won't negotiate myself down." Louis absorbed every word. Not defensively, gratefully. "What do you need right now?" he asked. Candy paused. "Time," she said, "and proof that this isn't temporary clarity." He nodded. "Then I'll give you time, without pressure." She leaned back slightly, surprised, but not impressed. "Good," she said, "because pressure ends this." They talked about practical things after that. Logistics, boundaries, expectations. Not in the language of romance, but of respect. Candy didn't ask for grand gestures. She asked for predictability, presence, follow-through. Louis realized something important in that moment. Love hadn't left. Control had. And control, he was learning, had never been the same as commitment. Weeks passed. Candy remained consistent. She didn't drift closer or pull away unpredictably. She showed up as promised. She left when she said she would. She didn't linger for reassurance. Louis adjusted his life accordingly, not because he was afraid to lose her, but because he no longer wanted to live in ways that required her to compromise. One evening, as they walked side by side through a quiet street, Candy stopped and turned to him. "I need to know something," she said. "Ask. If I say no to something important to you, will you hear it as rejection or as information?" Louis thought carefully before answering. "As information," he said, "and as something I need to respect, not overcome." She watched his face, then nodded. "That's the man I need you to be," she said. "Whether we work or not." The words didn't sting. They grounded him, because for the first time, love wasn't the reward. Growth was. That night, alone in his apartment, Louis stood by the window and looked out at the city again. It still glittered, still promised everything, but now it felt optional. He picked up Candy's picture, not to mourn, not to cling, but to acknowledge the woman who had refused to be an afterthought, and the man he was becoming because of it. Louis had never felt a quiet like this before, not the absence of noise, but the presence of understanding. The apartment, once oppressive in its stillness, now felt intentionally calm, as though it had learned patience alongside him. He sat at the kitchen island, the evening sun pouring through the windows, turning the city outside into gold. He held his phone loosely, replaying the last few conversations with Candy in his mind. Just honesty, just clarity, just boundaries. He realized he had spent years chasing love as if it were a trophy, something to earn, something to conquer. Candy had never been a prize. She had been a partner, a mirror, a presence that required equality and respect. And he had only just begun to understand what that meant. A message pinged. "Coffee tomorrow?" Louis smiled faintly, not because she had asked, not because he had expected it, but because she had asked on her terms. Not as a favor, not as a compromise. "Absolutely," he typed. He set the phone down and turned to the framed photo on the counter. Candy's eyes stared back at him. Not reproachful, not forgiving, just observing. He had no right to change the past. He could only change himself. And that, he understood, was enough. The next morning, the sun had just begun to warm the city streets. Louis walked into the cafe, the hum of life around him feeling less like a performance and more like a reality he could inhabit fully. Candy was already there, seated near the window, her posture relaxed but her expression attentive. "Good morning," he said softly. "Good morning," she replied. No smiles forced, no tension. Just acknowledgement. They ordered coffee and sat. Conversation began slowly, carefully. Not for entertainment, not for distraction, but to rebuild a rhythm of presence step by step. Candy spoke first. "I need to know you won't fall back into old patterns. Not promises, actions." Louis nodded. "No promises. Only what I can sustain." Her gaze softened, but didn't let go of expectation. "Good. That's all I ask." For the first time, Louis felt he could meet her terms. Not because he feared losing her, but because he respected her. Because he finally valued her not as a compliment to his ambition, but as her own person. Rebuilding trust. The following weeks weren't cinematic. There were no grand gestures or confessions shouted in the streets. Just presence. Consistency. Choices made quietly, deliberately. Louis stopped staying late for appearances. He began delegating tasks properly, allowing his employees to succeed without micromanagement. He rearranged his calendar to allow free evenings, not for convenience, but to make room for life outside work. Candy noticed. Not immediately, not with fanfare, but in small ways. Their meetings happened as scheduled, interruptions were minimized, plans were honored. Trust grew in silence, in dependability. And Louis, in turn, began to feel the weight of life differently. He wasn't losing control by stepping back. He was gaining clarity, depth, and the ability to love responsibly. A moment of understanding. One evening, after a quiet dinner together, they sat on the balcony overlooking the city. The lights shimmered, but Louis didn't feel the pull of power the way he used to. Candy sipped her tea. "I've seen change," she said. "But change isn't enough unless it lasts." "I know," Louis replied. "And I'm not asking you to stay for comfort, only to stay for the truth we create together." She looked at him steadily. "And if I choose to walk away, then I will accept it," he said. "Without resentment, without bargaining, without pretending it's anything but your choice." Candy considered this. Then finally she smiled faintly. "That's the man I want in my life." Louis felt a calm he hadn't known in years. Not triumph, not validation, just alignment between what he wanted, what he could give, and what she required. Later that night, alone in his apartment, Louis picked up the framed photo of Candy again. Not to linger in memory, but to acknowledge the journey. He realized he had paid a price. Not failure, not loss of love, but understanding. Understanding that came too late to prevent mistakes, but not too late to change him. He placed the photo back on the counter and picked up his phone. A message appeared from Candy. "See you tomorrow." He smiled. Not relief, not triumph, just presence. For the first time, love felt like partnership, not possession. Choice, not obligation. Respect, not demand. Louis leaned back, letting the city lights reflect on the glass around him. He was not the same man who had once chosen power over love. He was better, stronger, patient, intentional. And for the first time, he understood that sometimes endings weren't really endings. They were beginnings in disguise. He didn't need to chase her anymore. He simply needed to be worthy of the space she chose to occupy beside him. And that, he knew quietly, was enough.